Jeff Dayton-Johnson, you're Senior Economist for Latin America at the OECD Development Centre. This is the second year that you've published an economic outlook for Latin America, and this year comes right in the middle of an economic crisis. Historically, it's been said that when the US sneezes, Latin America catches the flu. Is that still the case?
It's true. In the past, recessions in the United States have had a strong negative impact on growth in Latin America. In particular, when credit is scarce in the United States for companies in the United States, it's also scarce and costly in Latin America. Now, the question today is this still true? The fact that most countries in Latin America have strong fiscal surpluses, they have strong trade surpluses today, means that they're less vulnerable and less dependent on external credit than they were in the past, at least in the short term. Let's be clear, a credit crunch will slow growth in Latin America, but the consequences don't need to be catastrophic as long as the crisis doesn't last too long. But remember, credit is only one aspect of this crisis. These will be precarious times for Latin America.
And is there anything that Latin American countries can do in order to mitigate the consequences of this crisis for themselves?
I think in general, many of the recommendations are the same as the policy prescriptions that are being developed in the OECD now. Looking after the banking sector, safeguarding that credit returns to the market in the financial sector of Latin American markets, and employing fiscal policy to promote development.
Well, why is fiscal reform so high up in the priorities for the OECD?
It's interesting because one of the consequences, perhaps an unintended consequence of this current crisis, is that it's put fiscal policy, spending, taxes, debt, right back at the center of the public debate. Fiscal policy is a powerful tool for promoting development, for taking care of many of the long-term problems that continue to beset Latin America, problems like poverty, problems like inequality. Tackling these problems requires resources. Our study shows that both fiscal revenues and expenditures have been increasing in Latin America over recent years, but the gap with respect to OECD countries is still a big one. Fiscal revenues as a percentage of the size of the economy was something like 23% of GDP in Latin America over the last 15 years. Compare that with 42% for the OECD. What's more, many Latin American countries are dependent on non-tax revenues, often linked to commodity exports like oil or copper. These are very volatile sources of revenue for governments. Latin American governments need to increase the quantity and the quality of both their revenues and expenditures.
And education is a top priority for you in this report. Why is it so important?
You know, education is important not only because it promotes economic growth, but because it has the potential to reduce poverty and to equalize opportunities in society. To really use this tool of fiscal policy, however, Latin American governments will need to spend more, certainly. But what's at least as important as how much they spend is how they spend that money. If you take the example of the OECD PISA study, which looks systematically at the performance of 15-year-olds on a series of tests in more than 50 countries around the world, those countries where students get the best test scores, Luxembourg, Finland, certainly spend a lot more money per student than Latin American countries in the study. But there are also countries like Lithuania, for example, that spend more or less the same amount per student as Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Brazil. And 15-year-old Lithuanians do a lot better on these tests than their counterparts in Latin America. This is one of the major conclusions of our study, that public expenditure in education needs to be increased in Latin America, but more important is that the quality of that expenditure increase.